Good morning, everybody. I'd like to tell you the story about the conservation of a lectern that we have here on display. This is an iconic photo I think that most of you all are familiar with, and of course I wanted to start with that, but I wanted to go to this one. That other photograph does show the lectern very well, but it looks like Kennedy's talking to an empty stadium, and there were thousands of people there. So, President Kennedy had gone to Congress and said that he talked to them about wanting to go to the moon. So think back about that time in 1962. Sputnik had flown just a few years earlier, kicking off the space race. We were in a Cold War with Russia. The Cuban Missile Crisis was taking place. There was a lot of unrest in Southeast Asia. Kennedy's our youngest president. The civil rights movement is taking place, and there was a real fear of nuclear war and the United States falling back in technology. Kennedy was looking for something to bring the Americans together to focus on something that was positive to help move us all forward, and by doing so, we could take the lead in technology. The lectern that President Kennedy used that day belonged to Rice University, and that fact was handed down by oral history through all the staff members. And after that event, it continued to be used at Rice University. You see this photograph from 1993, where President Carter was using it. It looks a little bit different here. You don't really see the wood grain anymore. Over 30 years, Rice University staff and students would put some more paint on it, some more varnish to make it look a little bit better. Well, at that same time, that same year in 1993, when President Carter was speaking there was a man who had just started working in the public relations office at Rice, who was a big space fan. In fact, his wife works at the Johnson Space Center. And afterwards, he was told that this lectern belonged to Rice University, but he was told that that's the same lectern that was used by President Kennedy. It wasn't written down anywhere. And so he went around and he talked to the people that had been there for a long time, and they said, yes, in fact, that was it. And so then he had to go find it a couple of months later and found that it was being stored in the drama department. And he said when he found it, students had been keeping their lunch on top of it. So he made arrangements for it to come to Space Center Houston, and it was loaned to us. He knew that it was a very important part of history for Rice University, but it needed to be at a place like Space Center Houston, which had just opened, and then more of the public would be able to see it. So it came here, and it was in the theater right behind us, displayed up front in the theater. The public could see it, but it was kind of in the dark, and it was hard to see. Fast forward to the 60th anniversary of President Kennedy's speech, Rice University asked if they could borrow the lectern back for their celebration. Unbeknownst to us, there was a historian that was questioning the authenticity of the lectern, and when it was now out of our building and out of the dark theater and at Rice, he was able to get a closer look at it. And let's see. I'm going to jump ahead to this. He got a closer look at it and said that, no, this isn't the real lectern. In fact, it's a fake, and you've been lying to the public for all these years. And so he first approached us at that time of the anniversary, which was back in September. And so we talked to him, Rice University talked to him, and we had no reason to dispute it. Rice said they agreed it was theirs. They always had it. There really wasn't any question about it. And then he didn't come back, and so we thought that was unusual, and we would want to look into that sometime. And I talked to my friend, who you'll hear from in a moment, Steve Pine, who was a conservator at the Museum of Fine Arts. And I said, would you like to explore this with me? And he said, sure, we'll take a look at it. He was in the middle of retiring, and he said, give me a few months, then we'll take a look at it. Then in February, the JFK historian and a reporter from Dallas said, "So what have y'all found out?" We hadn't done anything yet, but we were planning on taking a look at it, and they said, "We're going to go with this story." So in February, they broke the story in Dallas, and then that's when the historian and this TV reporter told the story that we had been lying to the public of all these years, put it, and really came down hard on Rice University. He said that Rice had no proof of ownership, and so it wasn't theirs to begin with. The presidents only travel with their own lectern. It's true today, but that wasn't true back then. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. It had no GSA tag on it, meaning it did not have a government tag on it, so it couldn't have been used by the president if it wasn't government property. It had no protective metal plates inside, in other words, to make it bulletproof. And there was no saw cut. That was the wording that they used. And if you look at the historic photos, you see this line right here. And ours didn't have that. And really didn't know what to make of that. And also thinking about presidents using their own. This is a photograph of another lectern. And I forgot to say this lectern was built by IBM. It was very popular, especially in universities in the corporate world in the late 1950s and then all throughout the 60s. This is a photograph of another IBM. And you can see the bottom is in two sections and then the top is separate. And in fact, this one has handles on it, so they could easily be taken apart and moved. So Steve joined us here at Space Center Houston, and we started looking into it and found out, we started working with the archivist at Rice and found out that that lectern goes back to 1960. I can recognize this lectern in any photograph now. Here's a photograph of President Eisenhower using it in 1960. It was used by university presidents and celebrities and presidents for 30 years. Here's President Johnson that used it in 1971. And that brings me back up to where I was telling you about where my friend first heard about it, this guy that worked at Rice University. And luckily saw that it needed to come here. So the idea that presidents travel with their own, my partner here, Carmina Montalaro, went to work on that right away, and she started looking at photographs of President Kennedy using lecterns before and after the speech at Rice, and he never used the same lectern. So there was no reason to believe it belonged to the government. Rice said that it belonged to them. The archivists looked, they had no proof of that, but the history says that oral history said that they did. We found no evidence that any of the lecterns back then needed metal plates. There was mention that President Eisenhower had requested metal plates added to a lectern at one time. Maybe that's where the historian got that from. Here's some photographs of, a couple of photographs here of President Kennedy using lecterns prior to his speech at Rice. After his speech at Rice, this is in San Antonio. This is on the day that he died. In fact, that morning he spoke twice in Dallas, and both times he used a completely different lectern. So it just, those things, that evidence didn't add up. However, I couldn't explain that saw cut. That was really bothering me. So we removed it from display. We put it in our collection storage room. I took some photographs of the top, went back to my desk at lunch and looked at some historic photographs, and I started to see that the wood grain did match up. And so I talked to our CEO here, and I said, I know for a fact the top is it. I don't know about the bottom. And then that's when Steve came in and picked it up from there. So I'll turn it over to Steve now.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. Okay, so now we're going to move into that phase of exploration and discovery of exactly what we had to work with. So as part of any technical connoisseurship exercise, you let the object speak for itself and you try to understand what it is you have in front of you. We disassembled it and found very quickly that what was being referred to as a saw cut was actually that there were 3 sections to the lectern, and that for one reason or another, and we were going to discover that and explain more about that, that the middle section was being obscured. So it was difficult to recognize that feature. And it having led quite a long history of life and use, there were a lot of modifications over time. So that was quite understandable, but recognizing the logic behind it and the sequence and whether or not there was any, whether the modifications were honest and just a product of use of the object over time, or there were some repairs that went on that altered it significantly, or there were losses. We were on the road to discovering that and helping answer some of the questions that had been posed, and hopefully we would come out with a successful conclusion to it. So you can see right away differences in gloss and texture and color, and that now we see that there are 3 components. It had lived quite a hard life, and we discovered as we went through some of the history of what we thought it might be appearances of it around the city over decades, that it was moved around a lot and it suffered as a result. I think it has such bulk and was intended to pretty much go into a boardroom or into a lecture hall and stay there. Although it was advertised early on by IBM as being able to be dismantled and use the top half perhaps on a desk or a table if this original configuration was less desirable. So I've itemized some of the observations I made of condition, and that some of those challenges were met with a sense of validation, because if it was going to be moved around a lot and there were alterations, that would help explain that arc of its life. And we want the object we're approaching it with as much objectivity as possible, trying to let the object itself tell us what its history was and what it is, and then try to match that with any documentation that we could also come up with. So some of the precondition issues in some other photographs, as we have the top section on the top left. This is a view of the deck, which is in fairly complete, but has some corrosion issues on the metal components, some finish issues, but it was also missing the knobs that would set the timer and adjust the clock mechanism. To the right of that lower center, you can see that whole console area that's been removed for examination and cleaning, and try to understand why it had the history it had. The top center is some of the condition issues of what you'd expect to see with that heavy box deck area being lifted on and off as you moved it, because it was so heavy. It was difficult probably to move from place to place. So every once in a while it would get, the edge of the veneers would get caught and would be clipped and tear off. So we saw evidence of that kind of use, and that's to be expected. What we didn't expect was what you see up on the top right, that I'll get into a little bit more, is part of what was the mechanism that made this special, and part of why IBM had so much success with this style of lectern. And I'll get to that in a couple of more slides. And then there was an alteration to the bottom, where now we see casters on the bottom, where most of those early images, we don't see that amount of space, and we don't see casters in the images that we could find that were historically important So there were alterations. So we go back to the documentation. What does IBM say that's supposed to look like, and what was its function? Well, there were some brochures that we could get hold of from the IBM archives, and the IBM archivist has been very, very helpful in our research. And these are some of the pages from one of their brochures describing what it was, and there were some images in that were great resources for identifying what the surface finish might have been. The clarity of the wood, that they went to great lengths to be able to choose to be very decorative. Solid wood around the perimeter of the armrest, and the framing, and a faux almost leather-like material that it was a synthetic that was used as the document deck, and placement and use of microphones. Now, disassembling into the studio to be able to examine it and identify what it needed and what it was, we took the deck off, the top deck, and put it on its back, and could see that on the right-hand side, that component that I mentioned as a lifting mechanism, part of a lifting mechanism with all its cords and electronics, was firmly attached to the bottom of the deck's surface framing that you can see more easily on the left. And this is that lifting mechanism that has gears and motors, and it appeared that some of the electronics and the mechanical parts of it had been overloaded, perhaps with an electric surge at some point, and that could explain why the clocks didn't work. They seemed to have been, the motors had been burnt out, and that the wires were also not working at this point. If we tried to pass a current through it, so that we could identify that perhaps why it's gotten to this point was maybe that there was an electric surge at some point that burned out some of these components. The light, there was actually a light also on the deck that wasn't working, but this explained in a nutshell why the deck was so low, and we were unable to see in its initial presentation that there was what they described as a saw cut, which was just really the sections resting on each other. So what was retained was the top half of this lifting mechanism, and the bottom half had gone missing. Perhaps it had just been misplaced, or maybe it was discarded because of some damage at some point. But now, without that mechanism, and on the left, you can see the witness marks for the plates for the sides of that lower section that's now missing. Everything collapsed down on itself. So this wonder of that mechanism and the desk was that you could adjust the height to accommodate the height of the speaker, so that if someone that was much shorter, they could lower it, and for somebody like Kennedy, who was a bit taller, they could raise it, and you could also tilt. There's a tilting mechanism as well. This little probe up here that has a little tip to it would touch the top of the underside of the back of the deck and allow it to tilt. So it was a quite sophisticated apparatus. But without that, we couldn't communicate that it was in three pieces and put it at a proper height that would make it more easy to recognize its relationship to what you can see in the Kennedy documents. So we had to come up with a way of filling that space and raising that half of the deck. So I made a filler that would match the height that was missing, and then put some other spacers in so that when we reassembled it, it would have a height that was going to approximate what we saw in the early documentation. Another thing that we did that was helpful in identifying that chain of custody over time was that as modifications occurred to the bottom and they put the casters on, and it must have been really run through the mill on occasion that the casters themselves were even replaced, so that there's 2 sets of casters on here, and actually the rail on the left, you can see the space here by the corner bracket is this rail here has been replaced, so that it had bumped around enough so that there was it was recognized that there was periods where it needed to be repaired, and it kept being modified. And it was kind of funny that we found that under the bottom of one of the casters that would not have been original because it had just had glides was the mark and a tag of a local hardware store that had been in existence still during the period of time we're looking at. So it just confirmed that they just worked with the lectern, and they made modifications to make it function and make it useful over time. But having casters created a height difference that was notable and didn't speak to correlate to what we saw in the Rice and JFK photographs. So we removed those, and I put a glide on the bottom that would approximate the size of the gap that we could see in the photographs. So finish-wise, of course, was very difficult to recognize how this, the relationship between what was existing when Rice had lent it to Space Center Houston. On the left, there's so much opacity to the varnishes, and it's they were so heavy that it was very difficult to see any of the grain that was a very beautiful walnut veneer and solid. And there was the history of losses and dings and repairs was also interesting. You can see, oops, I'm sorry, perhaps on the far right, a little test area where I tried to identify what the layers of varnish and original varnish were, and that there's a pretty unattractive putty that's in an area there that was repaired at one point. And that comes into play again later on, in that if you look at with those varnishes removed back down to the original varnish surface, you can start to see definitely the patterns in the wood, but you also see the history of use and repairs. And we felt that there was authentic to the piece, that history was important to be able to preserve some sense of, so that it was never part of the goal to remove all history of use and to make it look new, but to recover as much of what was original to the piece as possible. And you can see characteristic figure on the front and even on the side. I'd point out that we'll see this again later. If you pay much attention to how wood is cut, that every tree and every flitch of wood and every board is going to have its own particular character. And that comes into play also. So we're seeing in this enlargement of the proper right top corner that even in the Kennedy period documentation, that there was damage up in here, and there was damage to the corner that was repaired, and we decided to keep that as a record of its use and its age and It's a connection to all the images. So as we go back and take a look at some of the earlier images, I'd like to point out in particular the patterns that are along the top framing. When it's enlarged, you can see the same patterns on that solid wood and right across the top here. We'll see even in the LBJ image that there's a very characteristic figure right here that in the enlargement you can see is again found underneath all that varnish. So we felt very comfortable with identifying this as the same lectern that was in that stadium the day that JFK was making that memorable speech. And you can see by the comparisons here in a blow up of that particular image up here that it has the damage in the corner, which is still here, and the figure matches on the solid wood, but then also all of the features in the veneer as well. And this is the way it looked when it came back to Space Center Houston, is on display over in the gallery. And I'd like to recognize the people that took major parts in this project, and thank everybody that's been involved. And
So thank you, everybody.